Hello everyone, and welcome to the State Environmental Justice webinar series. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode. I would now like to turn the conference over to Mr. Charles Lee. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you, operator, and good afternoon, everyone. As he said, my name is Charles Lee. I am the Senior Policy Advisor for Environmental Justice at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I too want to welcome you to our fourth webinar in the State Environmental Justice Training webinar series for 2019. Our topic today is application of environmental justice to state environmental impact assessment. For those of you who had not attended any of the first three sessions, this webinar series represents a strategic investment by U.S. EPA to systematically build long-term capacity for practitioners working to advance environmental justice at the state level. As you know, this project also involves creating a repository of state EJ tools and resources that everyone can easily access and utilize. Hence, we are recording these webinars and will post them on EPA's newly launched EJ Learning Center website, the URL for which is on this slide. As we are working through the administrative procedures for doing so, you know that we have been distributing the YouTube links for prior webinars, and if you need them, please contact Erica Farrell from the EPA Office of Environmental Justice or myself. Before we introduce today's webinar, I want to share with you some important logistical information. First, we will have three presentations today. After these presentations, we will open it up for questions and discussion. If you have a question, please use the question and answer pod in the Adobe Connect seminar room, and Erica will keep track of them for us to pose to the speakers. We are asking you to type in your questions to ensure the best sound quality possible as we are recording this session. Needless to say, please mute your computers and phones. Second, we have provided the PowerPoint presentation in the Adobe Connect document pod and associated resource materials for you to download. And third, an evaluation will appear after the presentations, and we will greatly appreciate your filling it out. Today's webinar on application of environmental justice to state environmental impact assessment follows a very interesting arc. As you know, a hallmark of this webinar series is the idea that there is a set of methodologies associated with the practice of environmental justice that one can teach, learn, and replicate. Nowhere is this more important than the area of NEPA and other environmental impact assessments. Having a systematic understanding of EJ analysis for NEPA reviews sets an important foundation for application in many venues, including State Environmental Policy Act reviews and permit reviews at both federal and state levels. That is why we begin this webinar today with an introduction to the basic methodologies for considering environmental justice in NEPA reviews. These are based on more than 20 years of practice by some 20 federal agencies developed under the aegis of the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. The IWG was established in 1994 pursuant to the Presidential Executive Order on Environmental Justice. Elizabeth Poole, who is a member of that working group, will make this presentation. The publication of such a set of EJ methodologies for NEPA review in 2016 marks an important historical milestone for the development of the field of environmental justice in the United States. While we note that use of these methodologies identified is discretionary, they are being put forth as tried and true best practices for addressing the needs of environmentally burdened and socially vulnerable communities. Next, incorporating health considerations in NEPA and other environmental impact assessment processes is something of great relevance to environmental justice. This is especially true for social determinants of health. We will hear about a truly unique program in state government which has institutionalized the use of health impact assessments, defined as, quote, a combination of procedures, methods, and tools by which a policy, program, or project may be judged as to its potential effects on the health of a population, end of quote. In addition to how health impact assessments are conducted, emphasis will be placed on practicable methods for better considering health issues. Lastly, you will hear the riveting story of a truly transformative transportation project in Lexington, Kentucky. We are pleased to be able to present this because we all know how important transportation issues are to environmental justice. This is the Newtown Pike Extension Project, and you will hear about how many of the EJ assessment and mitigation elements were applied in real practice. You will not only hear from the key architects of that project, but we'll see a video about, quote, the road that rebuilt a neighborhood. Before I introduce the first speaker, I want to say that one way to characterize all of our presentations today is the idea that they are truly eye-opening. It is remarkable that such substantial work has been going on in addressing environmental justice at different levels of government. Our first presentation focuses on the basic methodologies for considering EJ and NEPA reviews. As I have said, it will be given by Elizabeth Poole, who is an environmental scientist in the Multimedia Programs Office of U.S. EPA's Region 5. She spends half of her time in the NEPA program reviewing transportation and energy projects, and the other half in the environmental justice program working on interagency coordination and capacity building. In that latter capacity, Elizabeth is an active member of the NEPA Committee of the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. She will talk about a body of work, like I said, that has been produced based on over 20 years of practice by some 20 federal agencies. Elizabeth, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charles, and thanks to everyone for joining today to hear about all this really important work. So like Charles said, I'm going to talk about the promising practices document for EJ methodologies and NEPA reviews. Very briefly, our roadmap. We'll begin with a quick overview of EJ and NEPA and the structure and function of the IWG. We'll also talk about some of the details of promising practices, and then we'll follow up with some additional tools and resources that might be of interest to folks. So the assumption here is that everyone or most people on this call at least have some experience with NEPA and or EJ. So hopefully this isn't new information to you, and when I speak in acronyms, you won't be confused about what some of this stuff is. But I just wanted to outline some of the main themes that we've looked at that cross the line between NEPA and EJ. So both seek to promote healthy and sustainable communities, ensure that everyone is treated equitably. The process informs the decision-making process, and through the process we seek to identify adverse effects, determine significance, and then avoid, minimize, and mitigate any potential significant impacts. Documents should also identify benefits and burdens, and then finally a reminder here to consider environmental justice in all levels of decision, whether it be an EIS and record of decision or an EA FONSI or even a CADX. So the Promising Practices Report, I'm going to go through what it is and what it isn't, but first of all, the easiest way to find it is to just Google it. Google Promising Practices NEPA EJ. It's usually the first thing that pops up. The NEPA committee of the Interagency Working Group, which Charles talked about, authored the document. And the purpose of the NEPA committee is to improve effective, efficient, and consistent consideration of environmental justice, share promising practices, and provide cross-agency training. So promising practices builds on existing NEPA guidance and practice and represents many years of professional knowledge and expertise, and captures thinking and thoughtful deliberation among those agencies, and it also allows for comparison and improvement within your own standard operating procedures. So it really is a compilation of methodologies. I want to kind of go over what it's not, because a lot of people see this 60-page document and might think it's representing something new that's never been done before, but it doesn't actually establish any new requirements for NEPA analyses, and it's not formal agency guidance, and it does not intend to legally bind or create rights for any benefit or any person. So it really is a compilation of existing practices, and that's something to keep in mind. The complementary work product to promising practices has not yet been published, but we call it the National Training Product, and it trains folks on how to use promising practices, and it also includes case studies and examples. And the reason I bring it up is because as I go through some of the details of promising practices, I'm going to highlight some of those examples. And so it's important that you know that it exists, but you cannot currently find it anywhere on the internet. But it should be published soon. I just can't give you a date about when that'll be. So the structure and function of the Promising Practices document, there are 9 sections, and they roughly go in this order that you see up here on the screen. But the idea is that they shouldn't be viewed in a linear fashion. We should be looking at we should be going back to other sections, maybe skipping a section, depending on what types of information and guidance you might need or methodologies you might need. So each section includes a set of guiding principles, which are sort of overarching themes to that section, and then several specific steps. Sometimes there's multiple methodologies in a single section. So there might be one step that includes more than one methodology. What a methodology might be used by a certain agency sort of exclusively, or maybe it's something that a lot of different agencies use, but we really wanted to capture sort of the entire spectrum of possibilities. So really think of the document as interactive. There might be a step in, section 1 that refers back to, another step in section 7. So you have to really think about the document as a whole rather than in a linear fashion. So we're going to go through some highlights of promising practices, but in that same sort of spirit, we're not going to go in order. Hopefully you've been able to look at promising practices before, you have some familiarity with it, and that this isn't all totally new information to you. So the first theme of promising practices we wanted to talk about is the foundation, and that covers 3 sections: meaningful engagement, scoping, and defining the affected environment. So in the meaningful engagement section, one of the highlights is that just because it happens to come first in promising practices doesn't mean it's over with early, but that meaningful engagement should be done early, often, and ongoing throughout the entire process. Engagement should be adaptive, flexible, and innovative. Some of the methods we highlighted were like hiring community members to serve as advisors or liaisons, and considering different segments of the population and how to outreach to them. For instance, how might you outreach to low-income transit riders versus sort of general low-income population? And then something else we really liked was doing a NEPA 101 training for stakeholders who may have never been involved in the NEPA process before, never even heard of NEPA before. This might be their first time, and so sort of setting expectations and doing a NEPA 101 primer is really helpful. In the scoping section, there's a lot of discussion about considering the multiple methodologies and required data sources. So for instance, consider whether it's meaningful to have one project area boundary for every type of resource, meaning air, water, noise, viewshed, traffic, etc. Since impacts will differ among populations based on the type of resource being impacted, you may need more than one project extent or project boundary. So during scoping, consider how separate methodologies might be able to address these differences among the impacts. There's also a really nice discussion about determination of data sources, and not to discount local or community data sources or cultural knowledge, in addition to those traditional data sources like academic, government, peer-reviewed literature, and that really applies to both raw data and methodologies. And then in the defining affected environment section, there's a really nice discussion about appropriate range and unit of analysis, so including extent, type, and duration, and whether impacts are direct, indirect, reasonably foreseeable, or cumulative, and how to interpret data. You know, this should include community input on potential ecological, aesthetic, historic, cultural, economic, social, or health conditions of the populations, and again, considering traditional tribal knowledge, and whether there might be unique conditions or exposure pathways that might impact the population differently than other populations. So on the left-hand side, there's this is an example from the national training product from a new highway in a western state, and the project team initially believed that a suite of impacts would be of most concern to the community, but then scoping really helped them narrow down what was actually happening to the community. For instance, the data really can't show this, but the most pressing impact for the community was maintaining community cohesion, bike and pedestrian safety, mobility, crossing and transit stops, not the sort of usual air, noise, water types of impacts. So next we'll talk about the two sections on identification, so both identification of minority population and identification of low-income populations. So sections 5 and 6 of promising practices cover these, and both sections include some math and discussion about data selection and math manipulation, other topics related to identification. In the minority population sections, there are two methodologies described, and again, I encourage you to read section 5 for more details. The first methodology described is the no threshold analysis, and that's used primarily by the Federal Transit Administration, that attempts to identify all minority populations within a given geographic area, no matter their size. The focus is more on the impact rather than the size of the population. And then the second methodology is the 50% and meaningfully greater analyses, which are done in conjunction. The meaningfully greater analysis seeks to be sensitive to populations where there's a majority of minority populations, and that invokes a reference community. There's a good discussion about what a reference community is in this section, how to pick it, how to document, why the agency believes it's appropriate. So I think that's really helpful. Then in the low-income population section of promising practices, there's a really nice outline of how different data sources can be done in many different ways. So maybe you choose to use the data of individuals below poverty, or households below poverty, or families with children below poverty. Maybe you choose to use a combination of those two. Maybe you choose local data that might be newer, more targeted. And the two methodologies described here are the alternative criteria analysis and the low-income threshold analysis. The obvious difference here is that the low-income threshold analysis uses a reference community, whereas the alternative criteria analysis does not. Again, see section 6 of promising practices for step-by-step and more detail. So there's also a discussion in this section about what happens if the lead agency determines that your community isn't a minority population or low-income population, but you, the community, believe you are. So you've self-identified as a community living with EJ concerns. In addition to asking the agency for a clear outline of data sources and methodologies, there's suggestions in here for alternative data sources, or suggesting where there might be a unique exposure pathway that would justify expanding the affected area to include your community or other additional populations. So now moving on to the analysis parts of promising practices. The first is developing alternatives, and you'll see this giant heart graphic up on the right-hand side. So this is, the development of alternatives is the heart of the NEPA document, and think here that there's many ways to get at this, right? We can expand the range of alternatives. What are some other ways to achieve purpose and need? Impacts can be reduced by modification or can be reduced over time. The project footprint can be reduced. The location could be changed. Other elements can be changed. There could be an increase or an addition in benefits. And the point here is that you don't actually see EJ on this heart graphic. You see that that you can actually talk about, you'd be talking about water or air here. It's nothing different than any other resource impact. In the impact analysis section, we've talked previously about how scoping really frames this section. Here we're finding more detail and info, and we're just filling in the bits of data with more information, more evidence, whatever you want to call it, into assessing potential impacts. There's a nice outline of types of data to use, like census or American Community Survey, but not to discount state or local data. Think health data, which is available by county, or a lot of municipalities have free or reduced lunch at schools, and states really do supplement national data sets, like for cultural properties, for instance. So in the last section on this slide is the disproportionately high and adverse impacts, and there's a good discussion in this section about term and phrase to clarify context and intensity and significance, and appreciably exceeds or predominantly borne by. All of these are phrases that are either found in NEPA or in implementing regs or the executive order, so I think that's an important read. And then there's two methodologies discussed. The first is balancing and the second is impact focused. So in the impact-focused approach, you consider only the impacts. The slides went away, Charles? I don't know if that's something on my end. I've got to share my screen.
I got it, don't worry.
Okay, all right, I'm going to keep talking then. So,
Yeah, just keep talking and I'll get it back.
Okay, thanks. So in balanced approach versus impact approach, or focused approach, the impact approach, you really only consider the impacts to determine if there's going to be a disproportionately high and adverse impact, whereas with the balancing approach, you actually offset adverse impacts with benefits, including those that are not inherently built into the project. The impact approach would only consider whether there's a disproportionate or a disproportionate distribution of benefits and if they're inequitable. And so if they are inequitable, then it becomes a determination of disproportionately high and adverse impacts. The impact approach identifies the disproportionately high and adverse impact without considering additional mitigation, whereas the balancing approach would. So therefore you wouldn't get to that determination of a disproportionately high and adverse impact. An important point here is to not, for neither approach, to identify threats to human health, to factor into the weighing of benefits, and be careful about attempting to offset something that's wildly unrelated. Like it's common to see in a document where we would try to mitigate losses of an environmental or community resource with, like, say, increased tax base or jobs. So see Section 8 of Promising Practices, Step 6 for step-by-step details on how to work through those two methodologies. A lot of folks are surprised to find that, according to the executive order, a determination of a disproportionately high and adverse impact does not preclude an action from taking place, but it must be at least identified and addressed. So then on the follow-through, that's the monitoring and mitigation section of Promising Practices. Here, due to the unique conditions and vulnerabilities, consider adaptive and innovative approaches, and develop monitoring and mitigation with the community, including accountability. Remember, we're doing things with the community, not to them, and stress transparency with stakeholders. This might include sharing the monitoring plans or selected methodologies and ways to get in contact if violations arise. Make sure commitments are clear and specific, and maybe even consider an actual human being that people can call when there is a violation. So, for instance, it's common to see diesel emission reduction measures. Make sure there's someone can call if a contractor happens to be violating that provision. So finally, tools and resources. Environmental impact assessment is a process that spans all parts of the environmental sector, including local governments, tribes, states, and federal government, as well as communities, nonprofits, professionals like contractors, and academia. So it's really important that we're sharing all the same tools, resources, and language. Methods described here can be applied by all parts of the system and work most effectively when there's a common understanding, communication, and collaboration amongst us all. So products listed here either are published online or will be soon. Will be soon is the national training product, but the community guide is available now. You can Google it again, Community Guide to EJ NEPA Methods. That is available. And anyone can use these. Anyone can use the other tools, NEPA, Assist, and EJ Screen listed here. Those are publicly available GIS-based mapping tools. So it's really important that we're all using the same set of data so that we're all really speaking the same language. So I mentioned Community Guide. The Community Guide actually provides a lot of information to communities who want to ensure that EJ is considered in the process, and it really is a companion document to promising practices. So the IWG NEPA committee is really an important resource to states and other groups, and we're eager to work with folks and state agencies, so please let us know if you're interested in individual training or additional information. So here is contact information for me, and then we have two committee leads, Susie Rule and Denise Freeman. Please let us know if you have any questions or would like additional information. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and that you came through like a champ. I don't know exactly what happened, but we shall carry on. The next presentation, our second one, will focus on the relationship between health, environmental justice, and environmental impact assessment. We hear continuously from communities with EJ concerns about the importance of health issues. And it was definitely eye-opening to find out that the state of Alaska conducts health impact assessments on a regular basis. Our speaker today helped to develop and currently manages this truly innovative and unique program. Her name is Sarah Yoder, the Deputy Program Manager for the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services Environmental Public Health Program. In 2011, she came to Alaska for a field placement as an applied epidemiology fellow with the Council for State and Territorial Epidemiologists, and worked with the ADHSS Health Impact Assessment Program. In addition to environmental health and HIA, Sarah has specific interest in community and tribal engagement, health education, and multi-agency coordination. In that vein, she serves as the tribal liaison for the Alaska Division of Public Health and as a co-lead for the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee's Health and Wellbeing Coordination Team. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Charles, and thank you to everyone joining the webinar today. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, great. You're sounding great.
Great, all right. It's really great to see the sustained interest in this webinar series, and I'm excited to talk to you all about health impact assessment in Alaska. Oh, sorry. There we go. Today, I'll answer some questions such as what health impact assessment is, which I'll commonly refer to as HIA. How does HIA fit into NEPA and environmental justice? And how did Alaska start an HIA program, and what does this program do? To answer part of this question, I'll dive more in depth with a few slides on our HIA toolkit and some of our principles and activities for stakeholder engagement. So health impact assessment, or HIA, is a preventative health assessment that informs decision makers about the potential health effects of things such as proposed projects, policies, and programs. The ultimate goal of an HIA is to minimize adverse health effects and maximize any potential health benefits. So how does HIA fit in with NEPA and environmental justice? Well, as mentioned in the previous presentation by Elizabeth, NEPA requires consideration of potentially significant effects on the human environment. This includes human health impacts. NEPA doesn't necessarily provide a lot of guidance on how to do this or what level of consideration is adequate, so there's room for tools, such as HIA, that are specifically designed to look at potential health effects. Also, we have Executive Order 12898, which instructs agencies to identify and address disproportionately adverse environmental and health effects on low-income and minority populations. Again, here's a place where human health impacts are considered or addressed. HIA uses a health lens to characterize the potential positive and negative impacts of a proposed project, policy, procedure, and so on. As such, HIA can be used as a tool for advancing environmental justice considerations. Using the typical steps of an HIA aims to identify and communicate potential health effects that might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, help decision makers and stakeholders better understand how a wide variety of health determinants and outcomes could be impacted, identify outcomes with health benefits, including health equity considerations, and propose recommendations that could yield greater equitable distribution of health-promoting conditions. So why was HIA of interest in Alaska? Well, we have lots of resource development projects and proposals in the state, particularly proposed oil and gas projects and proposed mining operations. You're probably familiar with some of these, such as the existing Trans-Alaska Pipeline. In Alaska, there's some unique concerns to human health that can be addressed in an HIA, such as subsistence, the use of wild resources, as well as limited means of transportation to many villages. 82% of communities in our state are not connected to the road system. High cost of goods is another feature that an HIA can address, as well as the unique stakeholders we need to engage, such as 229 federally recognized tribes in the state. Because of some of these unique concerns that relate to health in a changing environment, HIA was a good fit for Alaska. So a little background on Alaska. Things really got started in 2004 with some grant-funded HIAs. One was an HIA for a land lease sale in the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska, which is in the northern part of the state. And the other grant-funded HIA was for the extension of the Red Dog Mine, which is a mine for zinc. This early HIA work generated interest and concern. People were unclear about what HIA was, how it interacted with regulatory processes, who all could do an HIA, and what was considered a good HIA. It was also clear that future HIA requests were inevitable. Therefore, an interagency working group was convened and an HIA workshop was held in 2008. The working group determined that a state guidance document was needed, which led to the development of the Alaska HIA Toolkit. Due to a need for coordinated leadership surrounding HIA in the state, the HIA program was founded in DHSS and HIA work began in 2010. Most HIAs in Alaska take place within the framework of NEPA during the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS process. While HIAs are not required by state law, they are seen as one aspect of a best practices approach to responsible development in Alaska. We've completed several HIAs for proposed large-scale natural development projects such as mines and oil and gas. These HIAs have had various formats. Sometimes they are done as a standalone HIA that is over 100 pages and is intended to be an appendix to an EIS, and sometimes they are much smaller and are directly integrated into an EIS by the lead federal agency. In 2015, we updated the HIA Toolkit. We feel that it integrates the lessons we've learned over the years and now better reflects how HIA interacts with the EIS process and with other agencies. It is easier for other HIA practitioners to use, and it reflects feedback from tribes, particularly for stakeholder engagement. So if you're a state thinking about doing HIA, the nuts and bolts of the institutionalization of our program can be found on the link included on this page. So I've mentioned the Alaska HIA Toolkit a few times, and now I'll give you a sense of what this toolkit contains and provide a few examples of sections that could be useful to HIA practitioners in other states. While many parts of the toolkit discuss the nuance of conducting HIA in Alaska, some parts, such as the steps of an HIA, can be applied in other states. On this slide, I have a list of all the sections of the toolkit and pulled out a few highlights from each section. The first section is a quick overview of HIA and the process of conducting one. In this section, you'll also find some details about how HIA can interact with NEPA during the environmental impact statement. The next two sections go into detail about deciding whether an HIA is needed, and if so, what scale of HIA should be done. Considerations such as deadlines, data availability, and the scale of the proposed project are all considerations. Typically, a larger project in an area with crucial health data gaps translates to a comprehensive HIA. On the other hand, there may only be a month for a health review, and this may necessitate a quicker, more desktop approach to an HIA. Section 4 contains information about health effect categories, which is a way to categorize all the potential health impacts to make it easier to systematically consider all potential impacts. There are 8 categories, and they run the gamut from social determinants of health to infectious disease, healthcare infrastructure, and so on. Section 5, Scoping, explains how to prioritize health issues and carefully consider the proposed project in parallel with these issues. Essentially, how can the project exacerbate these issues, or how can it improve things? And what new issues could emerge? Section 6 discusses a wide range of baseline data that should be reviewed. It talks about some limitations of various health databases and types of surveys, and it proposes a process for the collection of new data if that is necessary. Section 7, which I'll talk about more in the next few slides, focuses on stakeholder engagement. Section 8 suggests a method on how to rate and rank potential health effects. And the next two sections describe the process of proposing mitigations and how that works within NEPA. And then the monitoring and evaluation plan, which is a way of determining how you can look at the project after the project gets developed and is in operation, and how you know health is actually being protected. So the last section of our toolkit provides a lot of resources, examples of other states and countries that have HIA guidance documents, and even goes into some detail about how an HIA might be funded. Since this webinar is focused on environmental justice, I thought I would spend some extra time on the stakeholder engagement piece of HIA. Stakeholder engagement is a crucial step in an HIA to ensure that all the potentially affected communities have a voice in the process, and it's one of the primary places where environmental justice concerns emerge. Our toolkit was revised with input from various stakeholders, including significant input from tribes, and suggests the following points. From the top, it is important to provide project and health information to stakeholders to the best level of detail possible, so that everyone is on the same page and can be more informed when considering potential health impacts. It is important to obtain public input throughout the process on components such as the nature of health risks, benefits, and possible locally relevant solutions. You also need to ensure that the analysis of potential impacts proceeds in a public and transparent manner. This is crucial for building trust with stakeholders. It is important to obtain local and traditional knowledge, scientific data, and other sources of information. Your stakeholders may have some of this data or may know where it exists elsewhere. Your stakeholders may find a particular resource essentially for the maintenance of their culture, for example, but you may not know this unless you have engaged the right stakeholders and actively listened. It is important to refine stakeholder expectations about the scope of an HIA, particularly when it comes to the voluntary nature of HIA and non-legally enforceable recommendations. Building trust and collaboration between partners is crucial for all parts of an HIA, as I've alluded to previously. And it is, of course, important to ensure equal opportunities for participation by all stakeholders throughout the HIA process. So all these points are key tenets for having a robust stakeholder engagement process. Our toolkit also provides examples of stakeholder engagement activities that can be done in various components of an HIA, especially an HIA being done in parallel with an EIS. For example, during screening, when you're determining if an HIA needs to be done, you need to carefully identify all stakeholders and meet with key groups to identify issues related to the proposed project. In scoping, similar to the scoping phase of an EIS, you're visiting with stakeholders, going to communities, and documenting health issues that are identified by stakeholders. In Alaska, the HIA team has attended scoping meetings with the EIS team as a way to hear a community's health concerns and address the issue of community fatigue by having one meeting instead of two meetings for two different teams. Communication with stakeholders continues through rating and ranking potential health impacts. An example of an activity in this HIA component is to obtain data from relevant stakeholder groups, such as traditional and local knowledge. In implementation and monitoring, it is crucial to present the findings of the HIA with stakeholders, especially potentially affected communities, and collaborate with stakeholders to implement proposed monitoring activities. Since HIA is not required in Alaska, this is particularly important as a stakeholder may be able to help garner support for a particular monitoring or mitigation recommendation that wouldn't traditionally fall in the jurisdiction of a regulatory agency. An example of this is, say an agency requires that the project proponent install an air monitor throughout the construction phase to monitor fugitive dust emissions. A company-operated monitor can sometimes lead to trust issues due to lack of transparency. To address this, a community may also decide to operate a smaller scale air monitor, which can help with anxiety people may have about being close to a proposed project, and it lets them have ownership of data from their own community. So moving on from the nuts and bolts of our toolkit, one of our current Alaska HIA activities is to maintain that HIA toolkit. We consider the toolkit a living document, so there's potential for revisions as HIA continues to evolve in Alaska. Right now, the Alaska HIA program is not routinely producing full standalone HIAs. We've had to evolve for a number of factors, including capacity and scheduling constraints. As many of you know, EISs can move pretty quickly these days. We're still participating in the NEPA process, though, to keep health at the decision-making table. In general, we're currently participating in HIA at the request of the lead federal agency and as a cooperating agency. The state of Alaska is often a cooperating agency in an EIS. This is also typically our funding mechanism as a project proponent provides funds to the state for permanent activities. We are participating at a level sustainable for our HIA program, which is currently one person, me, who cannot spend 100% of their time on HIA. So right now, we are typically able to offer to review draft sections of an EIS that are relevant to health. We provide technical guidance. We participate in health-focused workshops if requested, and we facilitate data acquisition. So I've got just a few final thoughts on HIA programs. And since this is an environmental justice-focused webinar series, I'll reiterate that HIA can be an important tool that can be used to advance environmental justice considerations. Another thought is that the HIA process can and perhaps should be flexible. Often, feasible HIA-related activities may vary due to factors such as changing agency processes, capacity at various programs, timelines for proposed projects, and the type of project being reviewed. Because of these factors, there may not always be the resources or time for a classic HIA. But that doesn't mean that health people should not still get involved. It is important to keep health at the decision-making table and to do that without being a barrier for the regulatory processes, especially if HIA is a voluntary program. To be most effective, an HIA should provide quality information on potential health impacts. It should engage stakeholders to the greatest extent possible, and it should propose actionable recommendations. And as I've said in other slides, an HIA is most successful if you find a way to be transparent, build trust, and be flexible. So for those states who are wanting to learn more about HIA, we do have an Alaska HIA website with a lot of different resources, including our toolkit. The links are provided on this slide. And I should note that not all links are active. I'm not routinely updating everything on our website, but there's still a wealth of information on that website. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about HIA in Alaska. If you have questions but are unable to ask them during this webinar, please feel free to reach out via email or phone. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That was really great. And our third presentation today actually will be even more eye-opening than the previous two. You will hear about the Newtown Pike Extension Project. Like I said, a truly remarkable and transformative transportation project in Lexington, Kentucky. We will hear from two speakers, David Whitworth from the Federal Highway Administration, an agency within the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Stuart Goodpaster, a transportation engineer formerly with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. David has served as the David has served with the Federal Highway Administration for 31 years. He has worked in various locations, including Missouri, Tennessee, Washington, D.C., Georgia, Mississippi, and Kentucky. He has held positions such as area engineer, safety engineer planner, environmental planner, realty officer, as well as both technical service team and engineering team leader. He has also served the United States as a combat engineer officer for 8 years in the National Guard and Reserves. He has been directly involved with the Newtown Extension Project for the past 19 years. Stuart is a civil engineer from Lexington, Kentucky. Through a career with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, he has been involved in a variety of roles, including construction inspection, structural design, transportation planning, and highway design. During his time with the Cabinet, David was the project manager for the Newtown Pike Extension Project. He is currently employed as a structural engineer with American Engineers Incorporated. Both David and Stuart are featured in the great video accompanying their presentations, which, as I mentioned before, is aptly named The Road That Rebuilt a Neighborhood. So, David, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Charles, for the introduction. My name is David Whitworth, and I'm happy to be here with my friend Stuart to tell the project story for the Newtown Pike Extension. The entities on this slide were instrumental in moving the project forward to where it is today. I'll give you let me orient you for just a few seconds for the location. We are in Kentucky, and in Fayette County, in the upper right box, you can see the outline for the county, and the interstates 75 and 64 co-joined in the county. And the center box will show you where the interchange of Newtown Pike heads south from the interstate into the central business district of Lexington, previously ending at Main Street. Our project picks up and extends along the Green Line to Broadway, with a later spur road eventually leading over to the University of Kentucky front doors. The extension was intended to assist traffic in avoiding going through downtown when it didn't need to. So the purpose and need in the environmental document were fairly simple at first: improving traffic flow, reducing congestion, and then we added improving pedestrian and bicycling environment, and then ultimately improving access to the University of Kentucky, which is a large employer and college in downtown Lexington. But the final one said to increase the quality of life in surrounding neighborhoods, and that's a little different than we normally have. Through good partnering and smart collaboration and accommodation, we intended to help all the neighborhoods, but one particular neighborhood was probably impacted the most and received the most attention. So because of the depth at which we provided environmental justice mitigation on the project, and because of the interest by the different entities around the country, the Federal Highway Administration decided to produce both a 32-minute video and this shorter 8-minute video you're going to see about the project development. Both you can find on YouTube with the title of this presentation. Now, Stuart and I could easily spend an hour and not cover all of the aspects to the project, but this hopefully will help see a little bit. Go ahead, Charles.
These projects are more than just highway design. They're more than just moving utilities out of the way.
This is environmental justice and a social equity type of a project.
In a way, it's kind of an engineer's dream, I guess.
Newtown Pike is a major exit off Interstate 64 and 75 into Lexington, Kentucky. Already a multi-lane roadway for several miles before reaching the downtown area, once it did reach the city center, it did not continue. That's where it ran into Davis Bottom. Plans to alleviate traffic congestion by extending the Newtown Pike around the downtown had been started and stopped repeatedly over the decades. The challenge was to address the critical transportation need without unfair burden to the low-income, historic, and cohesive community of Davis Bottom.
There were plans for the original Newtown Pike project to go through this whole area that date back all the way to the 1930s. The Davis Bottoms area was going to be wiped out.
My father and his family moved down here, and there was in 1942. It's been 5 generations of Demases that have lived down in here. Started with my dad, with my grandmother, grandfather, my dad, my kids, and now I've got a granddaughter.
I'm Hazel. Come from Urban when I was 3 years old. I've lived here my whole life, so it seems like home.
In the 70s, there was an attempt to put an interstate design through this neighborhood, and the neighbors actually stopped that road project.
The longer the project was tabled, the greater the transportation need became for downtown Lexington. By the mid-1990s, there was renewed interest in pursuing the Newtown Pike extension to alleviate congestion. In 1998, funding for the project was procured. A local, state, and federal agency partnership was formed. This partnership developed a set of guiding principles that addressed the traffic congestion, multimodal, and safety issues, while also emphasizing community outreach, environmental justice, housing, and neighborhood aesthetics.
And I like to call the guiding principles document our conscience for the project. It became the conscience that guided every decision that we made.
Federal regulations under the National Environmental Policy Act required that an environmental analysis be prepared for the project.
We did follow the NEPA process. We were made aware that this was a special circumstance, but we still had to go out and do the community impact assessment and the socioeconomic evaluations and to determine and document what the situation on the ground was and identify what the potential impacts might be.
A community impact assessment was conducted to help the team understand how the project could impact the Davis Bottom community.
In this case, we were looking not just forward with direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. We were looking backwards to see what the scoping and the planning of the project had already done to the community, positive or negative.
The project had been looming over the neighborhood for so long. A lot of the homes that were rental homes were in decline because the landlords didn't really see a need to improve them or keep them up maybe to the standards that they should have.
The community impact assessment concluded that the impacts to Davis Bottom were disproportionately high and adverse. Thus, mitigation would be required to offset these impacts in accordance with Environmental Justice Executive Order 12898. Various design and mitigation strategies were developed to address community impacts identified for the project. These included a boulevard concept for the road, an urban village to replace housing and relocate residents within the community, a noise wall required by HUD, improvements to a neighborhood center, redevelopment of a community park, and support for a neighborhood liaison and social worker during the process.
Because of the environmental justice issues, it allowed us to use mitigation funds for a variety of things that we might not normally think of or incorporate into a normal highway project.
We're afraid that the land, once the road was built, that the land in the area was going to be brought up by prospectors or developers, and that they would come in and they would tear a lot of the existing housing down and they would replace that with more expensive housing.
The project team brought in urban planners and architects to develop the urban village plan. As the team worked on the plan, they researched options for keeping the new housing affordable for the residents and managing the land where the new urban village would be developed. The option that best suited the project's goals was the community land trust concept.
which is ultimately what we decided to go with because it protected the property. It kept it affordable by using an entity to manage the property and hold it in trust.
One of the things that makes a land trust really unique is that it provides sustainable, affordable housing.
The vision for Newtown Pike is becoming a reality for the city, the neighborhood, and the roadway. The project features demonstrate how transportation planning, project development, design, and mitigation can improve livability while addressing transportation needs. The first portion of the Newtown Pike extension was completed in 2010. It extended the end of the Newtown Pike south into Lexington. The remaining phases of the project will continue south and connect to the University of Kentucky. The first phase of the new urban village, called Davis Park, was completed in 2014. In 2015, additional housing units are scheduled for completion.
To see the entire neighborhood and the folks that we'd worked with so long, to see them happy made me extremely happy that day. I could not have been more pleased with any project that I've ever worked on in my entire career than to go down to the groundbreaking and then the ribbon cutting when we finally had the houses completed.
When I first come down here, you know, I was like, wow. It's like just like I had moved somewhere else, not on the same street, you know. And then I was sitting out here one night and I was looking and I was like, I'm looking at the Lexington, Kentucky skyline. I thank God I lived to see it.
I think the Newtown Pike Extension project is a very unique project because it's a project with a heart. It looks at these displaced residents not as just people that have to be moved out of the way, but people that they want to work with and walk along beside of. I think that the displaced residents are the human face of the project.
If I may say, this has been the most challenging, but yet the project that I have liked the most in almost 35 years in Federal Highways, because it's about people, and it's a chance to do something right for a community.
Then.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So in the video, if you can make it out, there was a description of a guiding principles document that we established, being the conscience of the project. And it's been recreated here on this slide. It truly was the conscience of the project. One bullet I pulled out to call your attention to is the specific desire and an intent with which the project team intended to address both the issues of environmental justice and affordable housing. As James had said in the video, it was our conscience, and when work seemed to stall, or when team members got tired of the issues that we were fighting or couldn't seem to make headway, we tried to just drop back, rally ourselves, relook at what we established as our mission and our direction, and move forward. And this is one paragraph that always stood out to us as one of the most important, because it was a very long road project, and we invented many processes and many more solutions, and very little on the project was ever seemed to be easy. So this slide presents some of the studies completed for the environmental phase. The video mentioned the Community Impact Assessment, or CIA, and it included demographic surveys of the residents and was the evidence needed to decide if Davistown was a community and to what extent it would be impacted. So it was important in learning that this was probably the most economically disadvantaged neighborhood in Lexington itself. The area included mostly either lower income, handicap, elderly, minority, or some combination of all of these. And of course, as most people would know in these jobs that we're in, these factors went into determining that we had an environmental justice issue on the project. So then we conducted a corridor study and plan and looked at the neighborhoods flanking the proposed extension. This included continuing the rehabilitation of existing housing and new residential infill to accommodate residents, as well as diverse new households moving into the area. And a series of general economic strategies and residential and commercial development strategies were included in this plan. And finally, it was identified by an anthropologist with our team that there was likely a need for a social needs assessment. And so a social needs assessment is basically an inventory of what products and services were needed by the community, as well as an inventory of what products and services were available to the community, and to look at see what's missing between the two, and maybe where services are duplicated and could be reallocated, and where there are gaps to meeting the community needs or products. Included in this social needs assessment was a most unique and interesting aspect of the studies to me, which was called a rapid assessment process, or RAP for short. In order to do this assessment, project team members were sent one-on-one per household, residential household, to get a better feeling and to have a face-to-face discussion with each head of the household. It led to an improved connection to the residents and was considered to be a very eye-opening opportunity and experience for any of those involved, with which they were able to connect to each of the members and households. Many people that did this were out of their comfort zone, I will tell you. So why did we end up doing a lot of mitigation on the project? Well, we had to look at the big impacts to this area. You see in bold, there's 25 acres that was zoned as light industrial for a long time, but it included homes, businesses, a mission, a city baseball field, along with a lot of other things. In the area, there were approximately 30 residential households to accommodate relocation benefits for when it all started. Mostly were rental units and mostly were low income, as I said. Businesses were also in the area and they needed help to stay open, but under the Uniform Relocation Act, we're not usually making businesses whole, and this was another difference in the project. The residents who were in rental homes averaged paying about $300 per home. And that's pretty impossible to duplicate anywhere near this project location. And of course, the Uniform Relocation Act only accommodates supplements in our situations for 36 months normally. So the residences in the mitigation area were largely non-decent, safe, and sanitary housing. And of course, we were required to put them back into decent, safe, and sanitary replacement housing, yet there's none really nearby to accommodate these relocations. So finally, we were attempting to keep the community together during the project process and afterward, and we knew that would be a problem. So if we scattered the residents to available housing outside of the area during the construction of the project, we felt that they would become a broken community and likely never come back together. Stuart?
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate everyone coming to listen about our project. It is a very interesting project, and we really like to talk about it. So David has kind of gone through some of the needs that arose and some of the needs that we identified in the neighborhood, and now I'd like to talk about some of the ways in which we address those needs. And of course, as he talked about, we needed to provide the affordable housing. We needed to maintain this community cohesion. These neighbors had known each other for a long time. There were some of them that were not able to drive, for example. Some of them were unable to read, and so they kind of used the barter system to get along. One might help another neighbor with the paying of their bills and that type of thing. One neighbor might help another with transportation, and so they really relied on each other for their everyday activities, and so we wanted to maintain this cohesion. Also, we knew that this was going to be a change to them, that change from the way in which they had been living to the way in which they would be living in terms of what kind of outlay of money they were going to have. And so we wanted to provide them some financial counseling as well as other sorts of counseling to help them move, in particular cases, from a rental situation into an ownership situation, or just renting, moving from one home to another that required a different level of maintenance than what they had been used to before. And so we wanted to design this neighborhood that was a livable, affordable, and sustainable. Something that they could afford, and then something that they could stay in once they got there. Some things that we did were, one thing we did, we hired a community liaison. That's her in the white. And she was a part of the project team, and she had an office down within the neighborhood at the Carver Center, and she was provided a two-way conduit between the project and the neighborhood, and some have suggested that she was sort of a translator between project language and the neighborhood language. And so she would come to our project meetings, and then she would go to the neighborhood and talk to the neighborhood about what had been decided at the project meetings. Then she would also bring the concerns of the neighbors back to the project, and so she was sort of our conduit of information and our translator between the engineering type language and the social needs type language that the residents were providing for us. The neighbors also decided to set up a neighborhood association. They did this on their own. There were no project funds involved in this. And so this was another way in which they could continue with that cohesion that they needed from each other, as well as communicating with each other and communicating with surrounding neighborhoods. Something that the project did do is we had monthly neighborhood meetings, and in those project team members would meet with the neighbors, and we would let them know what was going on, and then we would also gather information from them as well. So in addition to the community liaison there on a daily basis, we also had these monthly neighborhood meetings where we met with the individual neighbors as well. And these were generally well received and well attended. We also provided some mitigation funding for classes on home ownership, how to take care of their home, money management type classes, and these were done through REACH. They were also done through the Nathaniel Mission, which was a mission, Methodist Church mission there within the neighborhood that helped us to get some of this information out to the residents. We also participated or put on each year an annual Community Unity Day, and we brought all the residents in the area, not just the neighbors there in Davistown, but the people who lived in surrounding neighbors came, and then also what happened each year, a lot of people that used to live in the neighborhood came back, and so this was a good chance for us all to get together to celebrate the community and to celebrate the project and to kind of let everybody know what was going on in everybody's lives. At this Community Unity Day, we did things like we worked with some of the YMCA and other city organizations in sponsoring and providing book bags for kids. It was usually held pretty close to the starting of school. The mission also provided some blood screenings, blood pressure screenings and that type of thing. So it was also some services were provided as well. The community garden, when there was a spot of land in which they worked a garden, and that gave them an opportunity to work toward a common goal and to work together and kind of see an end result of a project. During the time after we began acquiring the property and we were starting to build the first parts of the neighborhood, that involved the relocation of some of the residents, and their final housing was not ready yet, so we provided temporary on-site housing. It was new manufactured housing, very similar to the FEMA trailers that you might see. They were about 1,000 square feet, and we provided the rent, or if they had been displaced by the project, they could live there rent and utility free, and we did that because we didn't want them to be in a situation where they would be evicted for not paying their rent and not be able to move into the new neighborhood. And so this provided some rent control and some ways for them to save money. And several of the residents were able to save enough money through not having to pay rent, not having to pay utilities, to move from rentalship into home ownership. We also hired social workers. At one time we had 2. That was later downgraded, or that was later brought down to 1. But now that we phased those out, and the executive director of the land trust is doing much of this work. But the project mitigation funds provided for the employment of these social workers, and they provided counseling, help the residents find resources for various needs that they might have, and they also coordinated with the community liaison and also the new executive director. The Lexington Community Land Trust was set up, and what this did was it provided a way in which we could eliminate the cost of the land, and that makes the housing more affordable. The project put $2.5 million worth of seed money into that project. The land is owned by the land trust, but the structures can be individually owned by those who live there through a 99-year lease for those who were relocated into the land trust by the project. The goal is to have 100 family homes, and that includes 100 units. 14 of them will be single-family homes, and then we can move that into the other areas of the city. I think it was 10 years once the original thing was set up. Moving forward, one thing that I think the transportation officials learned from this is that construction projects affect real people in real ways, and that's something that kind of gotten lost along the way. And so we learned that through these neighborhood meetings, so we were able to provide these educational services where appropriate. For the most part, the residents are better off than what they were before. They have better, safer, more affordable housing than what they had. And then the neighborhood and the road have helped the city as well. The sustainable, affordable housing beyond the displaced residents has been released. Not only those who were displaced by the project have moved into the area, but other low-income families from outside the area have moved in as well and are now able to enjoy this affordable housing. So that's our presentation, and again, I appreciate everyone's interest in it and everyone listening to it. And I'll turn it back over to Charles now.
Thank you, David and Stuart. Listen, everyone, I do apologize for what happened during that video, and we will definitely make sure that the information about that really great video gets out to everyone. I know a number of you had sent us comments about that through the Q&A pod. So let me start. We actually do have a lot of questions today, but let me just start with a few while I get these all organized. So these are a couple questions I developed to kick us off. So Elizabeth, let me start with you, and that has to do with the in your presentation, you said that the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice seeks to be a partner and a resource for state agencies working on environmental impact assessment. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So already we do a lot of training for federal agencies, and this might include, somebody from EPA and somebody from, say, DOI, Department of Interior, going to another agency like Department of Energy and doing a training. And the benefit here is, even though, different agencies might have different standard operating procedures, there are resources that might be in one agency that don't necessarily trickle over to another. And I think that same thought applies to states. So even though you might be a state transportation agency working on transportation projects, there might be other resources that somebody from a different agency working on something different, like energy, that might be applicable to you. And so that's the really cool thing about the IWG, is that it sort of pulls all the resources from all the different agencies into one sort of conduit so that we can bring them to folks. And you might hear about some resource or tool or methodology that you'd never considered that would really work for your project, something maybe different.
Great, thanks. And Sarah, I know that many people are fascinated about how the state of Alaska has become such a, I guess, leading practitioner of health impact assessment. Can you kind of talk about how the idea of HIAs got started in Alaska?
Sure, Charles. So really it boils down to people and personalities. There were definitely several people in the state who were very interested in HIA and very connected with communities. Aaron Wernham, he was one of the leaders in HIA for Alaska, and then we had some interest in different state agencies. And our program manager at the time, Paul Anderson, he was great at talking with different agencies and really generating interest. So I think for us it was a lot of relationship building, really reassuring people about what HIA is and is not, and really just gathering that interest in agencies, getting the communities to know about HIA and start demanding it, and that really helps with keeping a program more sustainable. So yeah, I think for us it was mostly the people pushing for it.
Stuart, you and David have really provided us with a really remarkable story, something about the Newtown Pike Extension Project, and it's a story that most people don't know about. But I'd be interested in knowing, within the context of how that unfolded, especially with the role that the Executive Order on Environmental Justice played, which we know is a mandate for federal agencies. Can you talk about how the state of Alaska, the state of Kentucky, reacted to the concept of environmental justice during that process?
Well, during the process of the road, I think the thing that kind of set this apart from others was the need was just so much more visible there. And of course, anything new, anything different always is met with resistance at first. So, I think there was a lot of people that really questioned whether this really needed to be done. But then, as you get in and you realize these people's life has really been impacted, and that we've really put a big change in the way in which they're going to have to do things because of what we're going to do. I think people kind of softened to it as time progressed, and then I think also getting actually to know the people kind of helps. I think most of the projects we had done before was just there were impacts, but not to the degree that this project had. We'd relocated people's homes, but it was much more on an individual level than really a great big a whole widespread neighborhood like the Newtown Pike project had done. So it was. I think once people realized the need was there, then they kind of opened up to that and became a little more open to helping and more open to adopting the principles of environmental justice.
And David, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about not just what the Department of Transportation does in the Newtown Pike Extension project, but we know that it is only one of many stories that the U.S. Department of Transportation can share about its work to address environmental justice and social equity issues. So can you talk a little bit about why these issues are so important to transportation projects, and how the Department of Transportation has kind of been working to address them?
Sure. I can speak for a little bit, mostly as far as highways, because we have other components. We have railroad and we have aviation and things like that. But in this time frame, the executive order came out in 1994, and then this time frame of this project came out in 2000 specifically. in the 60s, of course, we didn't do things so right, perhaps. Roads were often accused of destroying neighborhoods because of it being the cheap. Some of the lower income neighborhoods were destroyed because it was the cheapest land to get for improvement projects and things like that. Well, not just roads, but a lot of things. And so that set the stage for the Uniform Relocation Act, and then in 1994 the executive order, and moving forward we have had leadership that has been more progressive towards implementing the environmental justice and focusing on that, and that's, I think, one of the important features for our agency is the fact that we have really put an emphasis on the environmental issues and addressing those appropriately and as they should have been. And even long after this project started, Transportation Secretary Fox, he had an initiative for reconnecting neighborhoods, I guess, several years ago. And this project was really, in my mind, one of those neighborhoods where we reconnected the neighborhood, because initially when I went there, it was like it was hidden in an area of Lexington that you might not see every day. And so we are really just more about meeting all of the environmental commitments and regulations and making sure that we do everything correctly.
Great. Thank you, David. So this is a question from Edwin Gonzalez, and I think this would be appropriately directed to you, Elizabeth. During the identification phase, are you required to identify limited English proficiency communities?
Well, technically, no, right? It's just low income and minority, but there are unique, a lot of times those communities might overlap anyway. So what might be a limited English population might also be low income or minority. And then at the same time, like, there are going to be unique vulnerabilities or conditions that might require like specific outreach, like translation services. So it's important to identify those populations because it might impact how the rest of your analysis or your outreach methodology, your outreach strategy rather, is going to sort of play out, and then ultimately whether or not you have mitigation that might be sort of, uniquely tailored to that community.
Great. I think there's another one here that's more general. Is from Susanna Aguda, and I'll just kind of speak to it. She said that she thought the having transcripts for these presentations are really something would be very valuable and essential. I don't think we have the capacity to have transcripts at this point. However, we are recording these, and so therefore, those could be useful along with providing all the PowerPoint presentations. The next one is I would direct to you, Sarah, and it is the name is not that clear, but it has to do with the fact that is Alaska the only state that conducts HIAs? Do you know of other states that does something similar?
Yeah, great question. So there's actually quite a few states who do HIAs. Some states focus on different aspects, such as the built environment or policies, but there's a number of states, such as Oregon and California. There's actually, if you Google Health Impact Project, they maintain a map that lists all the HIAs being done around the country and identifies the various focus of the HIAs.
I think the next question is from Judy Kalman, and if I'm reading it correctly, she's very interested in knowing how the project in Lexington around Newtown Pike Extension got funded, and you know, what was there a directive at the state level somewhere around how the project would be completed, particularly done so collaboratively? So I think I could direct that to you, Stuart, or David.
Well, I think the project had a record of decision, which of course is an environmental document that addressed all the different needs. All of the documents that were talked about in the slide were incorporated into that, and so that kind of became, I guess, like the Bible or the guideline for how the project was done. I don't know if that was the intent of the question, or.
Well, there were four phases for the project. The first one built was a bridge that you saw. It had originally been the last one, but it was moved forward due to some events going on in Lexington and them needing the bridge to be done. The funding itself was done with, at the time when we started the project, the state had a lot more money than it does now, and they funded it. The first 3 sections, I guess. The Scott Street Connector, which is the spur I spoke about, was still not funded yet, but it was never intended to be built at the exact same time. They pretty much used federal matching funds for all the project costs, and then the state contributed their funds. The matching fund, the federal funds were from their normal apportionment, and one thing we didn't say was that approximately the same amount was spent on mitigation that was spent on the roadway, and the project is around $100 million cost so far.
Yes.
Great. Let's see, Omega Wilson had a question around whether or not, I think, Elizabeth, maybe you could take a crack at this. Are there legal remedies for adversely impacted low-income people of color in tribal areas when government responses are dominated by racial discrimination, regardless of what NEPA assessments or HIAs say?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but anecdotally, I guess I'll say is, it seems like that's more of a Title VI thing. When we've seen lawsuits on projects, it seems to be under civil rights rather than under EJ. I don't know if other folks have seen that trend as well.
Richard Gelb asked that, so I guess this is addressed, and either you, Sarah, or Elizabeth can kind of speak to this. Typical HIA processes do not include an alternatives analysis, which then leaves the effort not only able to work on the margins, but on whatever alternative was selected, which may not be the most pro-health alternative. Is there an interest in a more robust model for HIAs that starts earlier to consider health outcomes of several alternatives and which tend to lead to more substantive and constructive outcomes?
All right, this is Sarah. I'll take a crack at that. I would say we're always recommending that people start HIAs as soon as possible. It gives you the most amount of time to engage your stakeholders, gather your information, and learn as much as you can about the project. Sometimes you don't know very much about the project propose features or alternatives until later on in the whole process. But it is good to work as early as possible. And in terms of an HIA looking at alternatives, it can be done. There's nothing saying that it shouldn't. I think it just really depends on your resources and what your scoping phase identified as what you're going to look at for your HIA. Some of the HIA work we've done in Alaska has looked at alternatives, some of it hasn't, and I think that's the case in other states as well.
Let's see. Did you add new ones here?
I just sent one.
Okay, let me, there's a bunch of other ones that came in. Okay, Margaret Korb said, I have a specific question for Sarah Yoder. In HIA Section 4, you mentioned there are 8 categories of health effects. Where can I find these?
So if you head over to that HIA website that I provided a link to, we've got a copy of our toolkit. It's in the toolkit. We also, on that website, have a section that we call Alaska Health Data, and then it organizes different health databases by health effect categories, so you can see the list too. But I can just read what they are. And these aren't the same in every state. They were developed using other guidance documents produced internationally on HIA. So you'll see similarities to other health effect categories. We do social determinants of health as their own category, even though that they're interspersed in other categories, such as accidents and injuries, exposure to potentially hazardous materials, food, nutrition, and subsistence, infectious disease, water and sanitation, non-communicable and chronic diseases, and then health services infrastructure and capacity. So not every health effect category will need to be considered by an HIA, but a lot of them do, and it's nice to know what the lists are, and it kind of makes you have to think about it and then identify whether or not it really could be impacted. So yeah, you can find these health effect categories on a few different things in our website.
So I think we're coming close to 3:30, and I think that was most of the questions. I apologize if I don't catch everybody's questions here. Some of these were not that legible as they came to me. So if you have a question that you want us to address and we aren't able to get to it today, feel free to email me and we'll make sure to track down an answer. So I'm going to, I also want to say there was a bunch of questions here that said that they wanted to know the contact information of the people that presented today, and these are all in the materials that are being provided with the webinar, and you can download that from the document pod that's on the Adobe Connect room. And I think, and then the one last thing is, of course, many of you asked for the URL to the video, which is which is in the materials as well, and we will make sure to resend that, to share that with you. I think with that, I think we shall start to bring this to a close. I said earlier in the at the beginning that we are going to have a evaluation at the end, and we would really like your feedback. And this is the questionnaire that's coming on to your screen now. That we would really appreciate your filling out. I want to conclude by making sure that we thank our speakers, Elizabeth Poole, Sarah Yoder, David Whitworth, and Stuart Goodpaster for their great presentations. I also want to thank all the people that helped to plan and put this session together. They are Millie Piazza, who works with the Washington Department of the Ecology, Stanley Buzel and Natalie Kajumba from U.S. EPA, Fleming Al-Amin from U.S. Department of Transportation, Sandra Whitehead and Ayana Jones from the National Environmental Health Association, and Kathleen Miao, Layla Mustafa, and Yvonne Wu, who are 3 summer interns with the U.S. EPA Office of Environmental Justice. And as always, I want to give a special note of thanks to Erica Farrell for staffing this project. We want to make sure to announce the next webinar, which will be on environmental justice considerations for rural water infrastructure. This will take place this fall. We have not yet set the date, but we'll share it with you as soon as we are able to. That announcement will come on the EPA's EJ website, as well as through many different other avenues. So with that, I thank you for being part of the webinar today, and we look forward to talking with you in the fall.